The lobby of Harrington Agricultural Holdings was quiet, in a way that felt intentional, like silence had been designed into the building. Clean glass walls, expensive furniture no one really sat on, a receptionist who barely looked up, and for 5 hours, Walter Hayes sat in that silence. He was 72 years old, dressed in worn boots, a faded denim shirt, and a hat he kept folded in his lap, like it still mattered how he presented himself. Most people in that building had already decided he didn't belong there the moment he walked in. The appointment was with the CEO, Victoria Harrington, a name that carried weight in business magazines and investor meetings. She was known for being sharp, fast, and intolerant of anything she called wasted time. Walter had been told to wait, so he waited. Hour 1, he thought maybe there had been a mix-up. Hour 2, he told himself big offices ran late. Hour 3, he stopped checking the clock because it didn't change anything. By hour 4, people in the lobby started looking at him like he didn't belong in their world. At hour 5, the receptionist finally approached him again. "She's still in meetings," she said flatly. Walter nodded once. "I figured." He didn't raise his voice, didn't complain, didn't ask again. That alone made him stand out more than anything else. Upstairs, Victoria Harrington ended her last call of the day. She was 38, controlled, precise, already thinking about the next acquisition before the current one even finished settling. Her assistant hesitated. "The farmer from Pennsylvania is still waiting." Victoria frowned. "He's still here?" Yes, that should have been the moment she went down immediately. But instead, another call ran over. Then another decision. Then she forgot. Not intentionally, just the rhythm of her world. Downstairs, Walter Hayes kept waiting. When the elevator finally opened 5 hours later, Victoria Harrington stepped out herself, heels sharp against the floor, tablet in hand, already mid-conversation. She stopped when she saw him. The receptionist looked relieved. "This is Mr. Hayes." Victoria gave Walter a quick, dismissive glance. Old, rural, likely here for some land complaint or settlement issue. She gestured toward a conference room. "Let's make this quick," she said. Walter stood slowly, placing his hat back on his head. Before he followed her, he said quietly, without anger,
"I've spent my whole life watching people decide I'm not worth their time."
Victoria didn't respond. She just opened the door, and neither of them knew that in the next hour, everything she believed about value, power, and ownership was about to be challenged in a way she wasn't ready for. The conference room smelled like polished wood and expensive coffee that no one had touched yet. Victoria Harrington sat at the head of the table like she owned the air in it. Her tablet was already unlocked, fingers ready, mind half in this room and half in 3 other deals she was managing. Walter Hayes sat across from her. He didn't rush to speak. He placed his hat gently on the table, folded his hands, and looked at her the way someone looks at weather before deciding whether to trust it. Victoria didn't waste time. "Mr. Hayes, my assistant said this is about land rights in Pennsylvania?" Walter nodded. "That's right. If this is a dispute, you should have gone through legal channels. We have a department for that." He gave a small, tired exhale. "It ain't a dispute. Not really." That made her pause for the first time. Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn folder. The edges were soft, like it had been opened and closed for years. He placed it on the table but didn't slide it toward her yet. "I own land out in Jefferson County," he said. "About 4,000 acres total. Passed down through my family for generations." Victoria's expression didn't change much, but her attention sharpened slightly. Large land claims weren't unusual, but they usually came through lawyers, not old farmers in worn denim sitting in corporate conference rooms. Walter continued, "Your company's been buying up surrounding parcels, quiet deals, one by one. I'm the last block left in the middle of what you're building." Victoria leaned back slightly. "We're consolidating agricultural logistics routes. It's strategic development." Walter nodded slowly. "That's what everyone calls it these days." A quiet tension settled between them. Victoria finally slid her tablet aside. "Are you here to sell, Mr. Hayes?" He didn't answer right away. That silence lasted long enough to feel heavier than words. Then he said, "I didn't come here to sell." Victoria's patience thinned. "Then why are you here?" Walter looked at her directly now. "Because I've had 3 different representatives offer me numbers on that land. None of them ever bothered to come themselves. They sent emails, letters, people who didn't look me in the eye." Victoria crossed her arms. "That's how business works." Walter shook his head slightly. "No, that's how people stop seeing other people." That landed differently than she expected. She studied him now, really studied him. Not as a liability or a landholder, but as someone who had weathered something she hadn't. Still, she pushed forward. "If your concern is price, we can negotiate. I'm sure we can find something fair." Walter finally opened the folder and slid a document across the table. Victoria glanced at it. Her eyes stopped. The paper wasn't a simple deed, it was layered, consolidated. Years of holdings, mineral rights, water access, agricultural leases, and long-term agreements tied to surrounding counties. And at the bottom, one detail stood out clearly enough to tighten her focus.
Estimated valuation $50 million. Conservatively.
She looked up. For the first time, her expression shifted slightly. Walter didn't look satisfied. He just looked calm. "I didn't come here for your money," he said quietly. "I came here because I wanted to see who you were before you found out who I am." Victoria stared at him, the room suddenly feeling smaller than it had before. And somewhere in that silence, the power in the room started to shift, without either of them fully admitting it yet. Victoria Harrington didn't speak for a few seconds after reading the document. That wasn't normal for her. She was used to reacting instantly, negotiating, redirecting, controlling the flow of every conversation like it was a boardroom presentation. But this was different. The paper in front of her didn't feel like a negotiation tool. It felt like a reality she hadn't accounted for. She looked up slowly. "You've been sitting on this valuation alone?" she asked. Walter Hayes nodded once. "A man doesn't need to announce what he owns if he's not trying to sell it every day." Victoria let out a short breath, almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. 4,000 acres in a prime agricultural corridor, mineral rights included. This should have been in our acquisition database months ago. Walter leaned back slightly. Maybe it was. Maybe nobody thought to ask the right questions. That hit harder than he intended. Victoria tapped her tablet, pulling up internal notes, her mind already trying to reframe the situation into something manageable. But the numbers didn't behave the way she wanted them to. The gap between what she expected and what was in front of her kept widening. Her company was worth around $25 million on paper, strong, stable, growing. But this one man, sitting across from her in worn clothes and quiet patience, controlled land that could shift entire regional supply chains if leveraged properly. She didn't like the feeling forming in her chest. Not fear, not exactly. Disruption. "You understand what you're sitting on?" she asked finally. Walter nodded again. "I've understood it longer than most people in your world have been alive. And yet you walked into my office alone," she said. "I didn't need an army," he replied. "Just needed to see who I was dealing with." That sentence stayed in the air longer than the others. Victoria leaned forward slightly. "So what is this really about, Mr. Hayes? Because people don't come into a corporate office just to observe. There's always a motive." Walter looked at her for a moment, then spoke more slowly. "I've seen companies like yours come through towns like mine before. They call it development. They call it efficiency. They call it growth." He paused. "But what it usually means is the same family's gone by next year." Victoria's expression tightened. "We don't operate that way." Walter didn't argue. He just gave a small nod, like he had heard that sentence 100 times from different mouths. "Everyone says that until the first shortcut shows up on a spreadsheet," he said. That made Victoria go quiet again. For the first time, she wasn't responding as a CEO. She was responding as a person trying to process something she didn't have a clean answer for. A knock came at the door, but no one entered. The assistant outside was waiting for direction. Victoria didn't call them in. Instead, she looked back at Walter. "What do you want from me, then?" she asked, more direct now, less polished. Walter adjusted his hat on the table. "Respect," he said simply. And honesty. Not just numbers, not just acquisition talk. Tell me what your company actually plans to do when it finishes buying everything around me. Victoria held his gaze, and for the first time that day she didn't have an immediate answer ready, because deep down she already knew the answer wasn't simple enough for a spreadsheet. Victoria Harrington stayed quiet longer than she liked. Walter Hayes didn't push her. He just sat there, calm, like he had already lived through every possible version of this conversation and wasn't in a hurry for the outcome. Finally, Victoria closed her tablet, not because she was done working, but because she realized she wasn't actually working on anything important in this moment. "We're not here to push anyone off their land," she said carefully. "Our goal is consolidation for logistics efficiency, reduced transport cost, faster distribution. It benefits everyone in the long run." Walter nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't change. "That's the language," he said. "I've heard it in different states, different decades, different suits." Victoria leaned forward. "Are you saying it's not true?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "How many people live around my land in your projections?" Victoria hesitated. "Around 1,200 across the surrounding rural zones." "And how many of them work directly for you now?" She checked something on her tablet. "A few hundred through contractors, seasonal labor mainly." Walter nodded again. "And what happens when you no longer need seasonal labor because your system gets more efficient?" The room went quiet. Victoria didn't respond right away because she didn't like the direction the conversation was taking. It was moving away from land and valuation and into something harder to quantify. "People," she finally said. "That's not something we decide in isolation. Markets shift. Technology changes employment structures everywhere." Walter looked at her steadily. "That's another language," he said. "Means the same thing, though. Just sounds cleaner." Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. "You came here with a land valuation and a moral argument?" "I came here because I wanted to see if there was still space for people like me in decisions like yours," Walter replied. That sentence hung heavier than anything else so far. Victoria stood up briefly, walking to the window. The city outside was sharp and clean, full of motion that didn't care about hesitation. This was her world, fast, scalable, controlled. But Walter's words kept pulling at something underneath it. She turned back. "You think we're pushing people out?" she said. Walter shook his head slightly. "I think you're not always in the room when it happens." That landed differently. Not as accusation, more like observation. Victoria sat back down slowly. For the first time, she didn't look fully in control of the conversation. "I don't make decisions like that alone," she said. "There's a board, investors, long-term commitments." Walter nodded. I know that answer surprised her. "You know?" she asked. "I've studied your company," he said simply, "before I came here. I don't walk into places blind." Victoria studied him again, realizing this wasn't just an old farmer who stumbled into corporate space. He had prepared, observed, understood more than she had initially assumed. "So what is this really about?" she asked again, quieter now. Walter leaned forward slightly. "It's about whether you see the land as a spreadsheet," he said, "or as something that already has lives built into it." A long silence followed, and for the first time since she had met him, Victoria didn't respond with strategy. She responded with uncertainty. Because somewhere between the valuation, the waiting, and the conversation, the situation had stopped being simple, and neither of them had fully realized yet that this meeting wasn't just about land anymore. It was about who would be forced to change first. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Farmer Dignity Stories for more inspiring farmer stories from around the world. Also, let us know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see our Farmer Dignity Stories family growing across different countries and communities. Victoria Harrington didn't like uncertainty sitting in a room with her, So she did what she always did when things stopped lining up. She reached for information. She stood up and stepped outside the conference room, closing the door behind her just enough to give herself distance, but not enough to escape Walter Hayes entirely. Her assistant was waiting immediately. "Pull everything we have on Jefferson County Holdings under Hayes family name," Victoria said. "Every parcel, every subsidiary agreement. I want it on my tablet in 10 minutes. The assistant blinked. "That's a lot of rural land data. It might take longer to verify ownership layers." "Then start with what's verified," Victoria said firmly. She didn't raise her voice, but the tone ended the conversation. Back inside the room, Walter stayed seated. He didn't look at the door. He didn't try to follow. He just adjusted his hat slightly and waited like time was still something he trusted more than urgency. Victoria returned a few minutes later. Her expression had shifted slightly, less dismissive, more focused. She placed her tablet on the table and turned it so he could see. "We ran preliminary confirmation," she said. "Your holdings are larger than what was initially disclosed in our acquisition brief. Some of the land connects to protected agricultural corridors and water rights we didn't fully map." Walter nodded once. "That sounds like your system missed something important." Victoria ignored the comment and continued. "This changes internal valuation models. Not drastically, but strategically, yes." Walter leaned back slightly. "You keep saying models." Victoria looked at him. "That's how decisions are made at scale. And people?" Walter asked. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "People are part of the variables." That answer landed between them like a stone dropped in water, quiet but spreading. Walter didn't react sharply. He just nodded slowly, like he had expected something close to that. "You ever been to Jefferson County?" he asked. Victoria shook her head. "No." "Then you don't know what those variables actually look like," he said. She didn't respond immediately. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Finally, she checked it. One of her board members. She stepped aside, answering briefly. "Yes." Pause. "No, I'm handling it." Another pause. "Yes, I understand the urgency." She ended the call and exhaled through her nose, a controlled breath that didn't fully hide the pressure building behind it. When she sat back down, Walter noticed something different in her posture. Not weakness, awareness. "You didn't expect this meeting to go like this," Walter said. "No," Victoria admitted. "I expected a straightforward land negotiation." Walter gave a small, almost tired smile. "That's what most people expect before they realize land isn't just land." Victoria tapped her tablet once, turning it off entirely for the first time. "That valuation, 50 million, she said. It's accurate?" Walter nodded. "If I sold everything at market today, but I don't." "Why not?" she asked. Walter looked at her for a long moment. "Because once it's gone," he said, "you don't get it back. And I'm not just talking about soil." Silence settled again. But this time, it wasn't Victoria trying to control the room. It was Victoria realizing she couldn't fully predict it anymore. She looked at Walter differently now. Not as a problem to solve, but as a man standing on something she hadn't understood until today. And somewhere in that shift, the meeting stopped being about acquisition and started becoming something closer to confrontation between two ways of seeing the world. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because Victoria Harrington had stopped treating the space like a transaction zone. The tablet stayed off, the pen untouched. Even her posture had shifted slightly, less CEO precision, more human attention. Walter Hayes noticed it but didn't comment. Victoria finally broke the silence. "I need to understand something clearly," she said. "If your land is that valuable and you're aware of what we're offering, why come here alone? Why not bring attorneys? Advisors? Why sit in my lobby for 5 hours like that?" Walter looked at her for a moment before answering. Because I wanted to see if you'd notice I was a person before you noticed I was a number. Victoria didn't respond immediately. That answer didn't fit into any category she was used to. She leaned forward slightly. And what did you conclude? Walter didn't hesitate. That most people here wouldn't have. That honesty sat heavy in the room. Victoria glanced down at the table, then back at him. You realize your land is sitting at the center of a major expansion corridor, she said. If we proceed with full development in that region, your property becomes structurally critical, not just valuable, essential. Walter nodded slowly. I know. Then why resist selling? She asked, sharper now. Most people would negotiate from strength in your position. Walter adjusted his hat again. A familiar gesture, like grounding himself before speaking. Strength isn't always about selling, he said. Sometimes it's about not letting something get erased just because someone else has a better plan for it. Victoria leaned back slightly. You think we erase things? I think you replace them, Walter said calmly. And call it improvement. That line lingered. Victoria exhaled slowly, looking out toward the window again. The city beyond didn't care about rural counties, old farms, or quiet histories. It only cared about what could be scaled, moved, optimized. She turned back. I need to be honest with you, she said. Our board will push for acquisition if this land is as critical as you're saying. If not from you, then through legal routes, eminent domain support, zoning leverage. There are ways. Walter didn't flinch. He just nodded once. I expected that part, he said. Victoria frowned slightly. And you're still sitting here? Walter looked at her directly. Because I didn't come here to fight your company. Then what did you come here for? She asked again, frustration slipping through now. Walter's voice softened slightly. To see if the person making those decisions still knew what it felt like to stand on ground that wasn't replaceable. Silence again. This time Victoria didn't interrupt it quickly. She looked at him longer than she had before, not at the landowner, not at the valuation holder, but at the man who had spent 5 hours in her lobby without demanding anything except being seen. Her phone buzzed again. She ignored it. Instead, she asked something different. If I told the board to pause everything, would that even matter to you? Walter considered that carefully. It would matter, he said, but not because of business. Then why? She asked. Because it would mean you're starting to see what I see, he replied. Victoria didn't answer right away. And for the first time in her career, she realized the next decision wasn't about growth or profit or strategy. It was about what kind of line she was willing to cross, or stop crossing. Victoria Harrington stayed in her seat longer than she meant to. That was new for her. She usually ended meetings with decisions, not lingering silence. But Walter Hayes didn't push. He didn't fill the space with urgency or demands. He just waited, like patience was something he had learned to carry instead of fear. Finally, Victoria spoke. I need you to understand something too, she said. I don't operate in isolation. If I pause a project like this, I don't just risk profit. I risk investor trust, jobs tied to this expansion, entire supply contracts. Walter nodded slowly. I understand consequences. She studied him. Do you? Walter met her eyes. Yes, I just don't call all of them acceptable. That answer didn't help her decision-making. It made it harder. Victoria stood up and walked to the glass wall again, arms crossed. Outside, the city moved like nothing was ever paused for reflection. That was what she built her career in: movement, speed, efficiency. But behind her, there was something she couldn't ignore anymore. A man who didn't measure worth in speed. She turned back. You said you didn't come here to fight, she said. But this is exactly what it is becoming. Walter shook his head. No. A fight has two sides trying to win. I'm not trying to win anything. Victoria frowned. Then what are you trying to do? Walter paused before answering. Make sure you don't make a decision you can't undo later. That hit differently, not as a threat, as a warning wrapped in calm honesty. Victoria sat back down slowly, rubbing her forehead for a moment, something she never did in meetings. This land deal was supposed to be straightforward, she said quietly. It was already factored into a long-term expansion model. Walter nodded. Most things are straightforward until you meet the part that isn't in your model. Victoria let out a short breath. You keep saying that like we're missing something obvious. Walter leaned forward slightly. You are. She looked at him sharply. And what is it? Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded photograph. He placed it on the table. Victoria didn't touch it right away. Open it, he said. She hesitated, then unfolded it. It was an old image, fields stretching wide, a farmhouse in the distance, people standing together in front of it, not posed like a corporate photo, just life happening. This was taken on that land, Walter said, 40 years ago, before it was valuable, before it was labeled for expansion. Victoria studied the photo longer than she expected. Those people, she said slowly. My family, Walter replied. Victoria looked up. What happened to them? Walter's expression didn't change, but something quieter settled behind his eyes. Time, he said simply, and decisions made by people who never stood where they stood. The room went still again, but this time, Victoria didn't feel like she was negotiating. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something she hadn't been trained to measure. Her phone buzzed again. She turned it face down without looking, and for the first time she asked herself a question she didn't like. If she moved forward with this deal, what exactly would she be replacing? Not land, not assets, something older than that, and harder to justify away. The silence in the room felt heavier than before. Not uncomfortable exactly, just final in a way neither Victoria Harrington nor Walter Hayes had fully acknowledged yet. Victoria sat back down slowly, eyes still on the old photograph. She didn't rush to hand it back. Something about it kept her still longer than she expected. Finally, she placed it gently on the table. I didn't come into this meeting expecting history lessons, she said quietly. Walter gave a small nod. Most people don't. They usually arrive after the history is already gone. That line stayed in the air. Victoria looked at him again, really looked at him this time. Not as a landowner, not as a valuation, not as a negotiation obstacle. Just a man who had been waiting 5 hours in her lobby without raising his voice once. Her voice lowered. If I recommend a pause to the board, they'll ask why. Walter didn't interrupt. Victoria continued more slowly now. And if I tell them it's because one landholder wants respect and honesty, they'll say I'm being emotional, not strategic. Walter nodded once. That's their language. Victoria almost smiled at that, but it faded quickly. And if I push forward anyway, she said, we acquire your land, we complete the corridor expansion, the company grows, investors are satisfied. She paused. But I don't think I walk out of this room the same person I walked in as. That was the first fully honest sentence she had said since the meeting started. Walter leaned forward slightly. That's the part nobody puts in the models. Victoria exhaled slowly. You're not making this easy. Walter shook his head. I'm not trying to. Another long pause followed. Victoria looked down at her hands, then at the tablets still sitting dark on the table. She had built her entire career on clarity, on reducing complicated things into decisions that could be executed. But this wasn't reducing. This was expanding. I need time, she said finally. Walter nodded. That's fair. She stood up. This time it wasn't abrupt. It was controlled, but different, slower. Before she left, she looked at him one more time. I can't promise what the board will decide, she said. Walter met her gaze calmly. I didn't ask you to. That stopped her for a moment. She expected pressure, negotiation, leverage, but he wasn't offering any of that. He was just standing his ground without trying to push hers. Victoria opened the door. then paused. Without turning back fully, she said, "You waited 5 hours in my lobby today." Scene. That line landed softly, but completely. Victoria nodded once, then stepped out. The door closed behind her. Walter Hayes remained seated for a moment longer, alone in the conference room, the photograph still on the table between them, like a quiet reminder that value isn't always measured in dollars or deadlines. This story teaches us that real value is not always visible on paper or in numbers. Power, wealth, and success mean little if they are built without understanding the people and history behind them. Respect, patience, and seeing others as human beings can change outcomes more than authority ever can. We learn that sometimes the strongest position is not dominance, but dignity, and that true leadership is not just about making decisions, but about making the right ones even when they are difficult. We got this lesson. Never underestimate someone based on appearance, and never forget that every piece of land, work, or success has a human story behind it that deserves to be seen and respected. That's it for today. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments which part of this story touched you the most or what lesson you learned from it. Thank you for watching and supporting the channel. See you in the next story.